Everyone knows SpongeBob cannot drive. He panics, he crashes, Mrs. Puff swells up to twice her size, and the whole thing resets the following week. Somewhere inside Nickelodeon, a document explains why he is never allowed to pass. Nobody was joking when they wrote it. In this video, we break down why SpongeBob keeps failing his boating test, the unicycle he threw in the dumpster. 4 episodes into the first season, in the first week of August 1999, a small yellow sponge rode up to a driving school on a unicycle and threw it into a dumpster. He told the machine out loud that he would not be needing it anymore. He said it warmly. He had never once passed this test, and he had no reason on earth to be that confident. The episode is called Boating School, and the 20 minutes that follow decided the next quarter of a century of this show. It went out on the 7th of August, paired with a segment about noisy neighbors. Sherm Cohen and Ennio Torresan Jr. ran the storyboard, with Aaron Springer and Eric Wiesa working alongside them. Those 4 share the writing credit with Doug Lawrence, who most people know as Mr. Lawrence, and the credit covers both halves of the episode rather than this segment alone. Derek Drymon served as creative director. Fred Miller and Tom Yasumi directed the animation. The show was barely a month old and still working out what it was, and this one segment handed it 2 things it would lean on for the rest of its life. The paper trail behind it runs back further than the air date suggests. A dialogue draft carries a date in late February of 1998, more than a year before broadcast. The recording script was drafted that August. The finished master reached Nickelodeon Animation Studio in the first week of July 1999, about a month before anybody saw it. All of that is knowable for an unusual reason. In November of 2016, the recording scripts for every episode of the first season turned up in public, sitting on one of the asset discs for a PlayStation game called Super Sponge. Nobody at the studio released them deliberately. They had been pressed onto a disc, shipped to whoever bought the game, and left there for 17 years before anybody thought to look. The morning opens the way almost every early episode opens, with a slow drift over Conch Street. A foghorn alarm sounds at 7, pitched slightly higher than usual, which nobody notices consciously and everybody feels. SpongeBob lands on a calendar. The calendar has exactly one thing written on it, in red capitals. His boating exam is today, and the square he lands on is the 3rd of March. Then comes the unicycle, and the dumpster, and the cheerful goodbye to a machine he has decided he has outgrown. That is the first joke of the episode, and the last one whose full weight the audience understands, because the show then spends 20 minutes explaining how wrong he was. Mrs. Puff arrives for the first time in television history in this segment. So does the boating school, a sunken lighthouse fitted out as a classroom with boats parked outside it. Neither of them existed before this episode aired. Neither has been away for long since. Her full name is Penelope Puff, though almost nobody in Bikini Bottom ever uses it. She is a pufferfish, she is a state-accredited boating instructor, and by the end of these 20 minutes, she will have been hospitalized once and destroyed twice. Nothing about that setting makes sense, and the show has never explained it. A lighthouse exists to stop boats crashing into things. Handing that particular building to the worst driver in the ocean is a joke all on its own. The writers went on to demolish it more times than anybody has bothered to count. Counting comes up later that night, and it arrives as a joke about itself. Lying in bed after another failure, SpongeBob tells Gary he is tired of failing that boating test and has already taken it 37 times. Gary meows once. Okay, 38, SpongeBob says, and pulls a pillow over his head. Both numbers leave his mouth inside a couple of seconds. The show established a running total and contradicted it as a gag in the very first scene where the total was ever mentioned. Every fan who has since tried to count the failures is chasing a figure the writers made unstable on day 1. He does it again, half an hour later, which almost nobody remembers. Explaining the problem to Patrick through a closet door, he starts on 37, Gary meows off screen, and he corrects himself a second time. The snail has audited him twice in one evening. Then he says the sentence that explains the entire premise of this show for the next 25 years. He knows all the answers, he tells the room, right up until the moment he gets behind the wheel. The oral portion proves the first half of that without difficulty. Mrs. Puff starts asking questions, and he answers them before she has finished asking. He rattles off correct responses to things she has not said yet. No other student in that room comes anywhere close. On paper, he is the best driver she has ever taught. All of it reverses the moment the practical portion begins. He gets into the boat. The confidence drains out of him in about 2 seconds. Then he floors it. The boat leaves the course entirely and goes through the lighthouse, which is to say it goes through the school, which is to say he destroys the building he is being tested inside. Mrs. Puff inflates for the first time on camera. Her voice drops about an octave. She asks him one despairing word about why. Something else debuts in that crash, buried under the wreckage where almost nobody caught it at the time. A voice off-screen shouts that his leg has been hurt. The closed captions simply read, "Man," because the character is nowhere on screen and does not have a name yet. The fish doing the shouting had already been drawn. He turns up in the very first minutes of the series, in the segment about the reef blower, driving past in a boat, one of the 2 earliest background characters the show ever produced. Nobody calls him Fred until in episode 2 seasons later about a talking dog at a sandwich stand. Here he is an off-screen noise the caption writer could not identify. That shout became one of the most repeated running gags the show ever produced. It started in the same 20 minutes as the boating test, in the same crash as collateral damage. 20 years on, the show built an entire episode around his leg, opening it with a montage of every previous injury, and the first clip in that montage is this one. Two of the longest-running jokes in the series therefore begin in the same accident. A show barely a month old introduced its most durable antagonist, its most durable setting, its most repeated background gag, and its central unfinishable premise, all inside a single 11-minute segment about a driving test. The second act is where this stops being a simple joke about a bad driver and turns into something with a shape. SpongeBob goes home and mopes at Gary. He is defeated in the specific way a person is defeated when they have failed at the same thing dozens of times and have run out of theories about why. Then a voice comes through a walkie-talkie. Patrick appears inside his closet wearing square pants and a shirt and tie, announcing himself as Patrick Squarepants. The disguise is not remotely convincing, and the episode makes no attempt to pretend otherwise. Patrick has a plan, and the plan involves minor surgery. He plants a walkie-talkie antenna directly into SpongeBob's head and covers the whole arrangement with a cowboy hat. That hat, for a viewer looking at it longer than a second, is shaped exactly like the logo of a roadside sandwich chain. The early seasons buried jokes like that in the background and never mentioned them again. From the safety of the house, Patrick will feed him every answer he needs. What follows is the closest thing to competence this character has ever shown behind a wheel, and the show plays it completely straight. Patrick tells him to freeze. He freezes on the spot. Patrick says the words big toe, and SpongeBob's big toe pops out through the end of his shoe. The toe works the pedal like a man who has been driving boats for decades. The instructions Patrick reads out are worth hearing in order, because the course is more absurd than the joke needs. Start the boat. Put it in drive. Avoid crashing into the wall. Turn right. Stop at the sign. Look both ways. Then it stops being a driving test. Turn around a flagpole. Drive vertically up a road. Jump over an anchor. Fly through a ring of fire. Help a man cross the street. Then help a woman cross the road. Pop a wheelie. Drive upside down. Get back on the road and cross the finish line. SpongeBob does all of it. The whole sequence plays as a montage set to a piece of the show's early music, and it works. And Mrs. Puff stands there, watching her worst student clear a course that would trouble a stunt driver. Underneath that montage, the show is doing something quietly cruel to him. While SpongeBob is out on the water driving beautifully, Patrick is working his way through the house. He eats the food. He reads the diary out loud to nobody. The person delivering the miracle is not invested in the miracle at all. That detail sets up something the show returns to for years afterward. The people around SpongeBob are rarely trying to sabotage him. They are busy with their own afternoon. His enormous ambition to pass a driving test does not register as urgent to anybody else in Bikini Bottom, including the friend who has just performed surgery on his skull to help. Then comes the turn, and the turn is why this episode matters more than any other episode about the boating test. Mrs. Puff, delighted and slightly bewildered, makes a joke. She says he is driving so well that he must have somebody miles away feeding him the answers. She is not accusing him of anything. She is complimenting him in the clumsy way a teacher compliments a student who has surprised her, and the joke is supposed to be absurd because the idea is absurd. SpongeBob hears it, and something goes wrong behind his eyes. He says out loud that a thing like that would be cheating. The realization arrives all at once and takes him apart from the inside. Patrick, on the other end of the walkie-talkie, starts crying and runs out of the house. And SpongeBob, alone in a boat with a hat full of radio equipment and no more answers coming through it, drives directly into the school for the second time in one episode. The last shot of Mrs. Puff has her being loaded into an ambulance, fully inflated, destroyed twice in a single day by the same student. SpongeBob leaves on Gary's unicycle. He is cheerful again. He suggests the two of them go and surprise somebody at the hospital. That ending is stranger than the episode needed. He did not fail because he is stupid, and the episode goes out of its way to prove he is not. He answered the oral questions before they were finished. He did not fail because he cannot physically operate a boat, because the montage shows him doing it perfectly for minutes on end. He failed because his conscience did more damage than his driving ever had. A simpler version of this story has him crash because he is a bad driver, learn nothing, and try again the following week. That version would have worked perfectly well for a Saturday morning cartoon. The version that aired makes the failure a moral event instead of a mechanical one. It leaves the audience holding a character who is fully capable and completely doomed at the same time. Every long-running cartoon has a machine at the center of it that must never finish its work. The coyote never catches the bird. The cat never eats the mouse. The shape of the thing depends on the chase staying unfinished, and the moment one of them wins, there is nothing left to make next week. Boating School built that machine out of a driving test in 20 minutes in the summer of 1999. It also established the two halves of the joke the writers would keep pulling apart for the next 2 decades. One, SpongeBob knows things. He has memorized the manual and could pass any written examination put in front of him. The other gets into a boat and stops being that person. The show treats those as two different people sharing a body. Almost Almost every boating episode afterward is built on the gap between them. That 37, or 38, says something about the timeline as well. The number is spoken in the 4th episode of the first season. Before the audience had ever met him, this character had already attempted and failed the same examination nearly 40 times. The show did not build the gag across several seasons and then look back at it fondly. The gag arrived fully formed, with decades of failure already sitting behind it before most viewers had learned his name. Everything afterward is a variation on that one segment. The teacher gets angrier, the crashes get much bigger, the consequences get much worse for everybody standing nearby, and the number climbs into figures that make no sense at all. The final image of the original is a sponge riding away on a unicycle he had thrown in a dumpster that same morning because he was certain he had passed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The reason he is not allowed to pass was never left to the writers. Somebody inside the company that owns him wrote it down in the spring of 2013 in a document about lunchboxes and cereal boxes. Comedy barely comes into it at all. Section 2, the rule that says he can never win Nickelodeon, keeps an internal document called the SpongeBob Core Creative Strategy, written to hold everybody who handles the character to the same set of rules. On page 20 of it sits a line about the boating test. SpongeBob can never permanently receive his boating license, it says. Then it gives the reason in the same breath, tucked inside a bracket, the way a person notes something everybody in the room already agrees on. Keeping him unlicensed is what keeps Mrs. Puff a key character in his world. The source matters as much as the sentence. These are internal guidelines, never a statement aimed at an audience. No executive has ever stood on a stage and read that line out loud. The wording is consistent everywhere it turns up, and the honest description of it is a working document rather than a press release. Guides of that kind exist for every large franchise, and they are usually very dull. Dozens of pages of color codes, approved poses, phrases nobody is allowed to print on a cereal box. They matter here because they record what a company believes about its own characters when it is talking to itself. That is a good deal more honest than a press release. Then there is the reasoning, which inverts the way most people assume this joke works. A viewer watching SpongeBob crash for the 400th time assumes the show keeps him failing because failure is funnier than success. The document gives a completely different reason, and the reason turns out to be staffing. If SpongeBob passes, Mrs. Puff has no function left in the world of the show. A character the company considers essential would quietly disappear from the series. So the joke exists, in the end, to protect somebody's job. All of that makes far more sense once the origin of Mrs. Puff is understood. She was not part of the original plan at all. She very nearly did not exist. When Steven Hillenburg was trying to sell this show to Nickelodeon in the late 1990s, the network had a formula it trusted, built around programs like Hey Arnold. The formula involved putting a child protagonist inside a school. That was the note Hillenburg received, and it was not framed as a suggestion, make SpongeBob a child, put him in a classroom. That was understood at the time to be the shape of a successful Nickelodeon cartoon. Hillenburg did not want to do it. By his own later account, he was prepared to walk away from the whole project over it. He had designed SpongeBob as an adult with a job and a house and a mortgage, or the underwater equivalent of one, and turning him into a school child would have dismantled the character before a single episode existed. The distinction sounds small, and it is not. Almost every joke in the series depends on SpongeBob being an adult who behaves like a child, and not a child behaving like one. His enthusiasm for a fast food job is only funny if he is old enough to know better. His devotion to a boating license is only funny if everybody around him already has one. What he came up with instead is one of the more elegant compromises in television. He gave the network a school, exactly as asked. He made it a driving school. The solution satisfies a note completely while inverting the intention behind it. The network wanted a classroom because classrooms mean children, and children were what the research said worked. Hillenburg supplied a classroom that means the opposite, since attending one is a marker of adulthood. He did it without arguing about the note at all. An adult can attend a driving school without being a child in any way. The classroom was there. The teacher was there. The formula the network asked for was there on paper, while SpongeBob's age stayed permanently and usefully vague. Mrs. Puff was the character that compromise required, and she was the last main character added to the show. When Hillenburg first pitched the series, she did not exist, and neither did the endless license hunt. She arrived in the third draft of the pitch Bible after Nickelodeon had rejected the first two. That sequence is documented in an odd place. The June 2003 issue of Nickelodeon magazine ran a cover story on where SpongeBob came from, and inside it was a section on the original cast lineup headed with the observation that the gang was all there, almost. Mrs. Puff was the almost. A drawing of the main characters, printed years after the show became a hit, had to be captioned around a small awkwardness. The teacher had not been invented yet when the rest of them were. The note itself has been quoted more precisely elsewhere. Nickelodeon wanted SpongeBob to be, in Hillenburg's account of what he was told, Arnold under the sea. He told them plainly that this was not the show. He was generous about it afterward, and creators do not always talk that way about notes they resisted. Speaking Speaking in 2012, he described the compromise as a positive thing overall, specifically because it brought in a new character. He said plainly that he loved her, and that she added something to the show he would not have found otherwise. Others who worked on the series have gone further than he did. On Nickelodeon's own podcast about the show, the hosts put it in terms that sound overstated until the timeline is laid out beside them. Hillenburg might not have made SpongeBob at all if it had not been for Mrs. Puff and the boating school. He was ready to walk. She is what let him stay. The size of that claim is easy to skate past. The most successful animated series of the last 30 years may only exist because somebody invented a pufferfish driving instructor to settle a disagreement about whether the main character was allowed to be an adult, and the price of that solution was that her student could never be permitted to graduate. Graduation would end her employment and unpick the compromise that got the show made. None of this is unusual in long-running television, and it has a name writers use without embarrassment. The status quo is the thing the format protects above all else, which means the central want of the protagonist has to be deferred permanently. The moment the want is satisfied, the engine stops turning. Every sitcom that has ever run more than a few years works the same way. The romance that never quite resolves. The underdog who never quite takes the championship. The family that never quite manages to leave town. All of them are the same machine, wearing different clothes. What separates SpongeBob from most of those examples is how completely the show admits it. Other series pretend the resolution is coming and keep deferring it quietly. This one built a character whose entire professional existence depends on the failure continuing, handed her a classroom, and then spent 25 years demolishing that classroom on camera. That admission goes further than the format usually allows. The show has established, repeatedly and without irony, that SpongeBob knows every answer to the oral exam and is the most committed student in that room. Mrs. Puff would like nothing better than to pass him. Neither of those facts has ever been in dispute inside the story. The obstacle is not knowledge, and it is not effort, and it is not her willingness. Everybody involved wants the same outcome, and none of them are permitted to reach it. The show got there on its own, years before anybody typed the rule up. In an episode from 2001, told he has failed again, SpongeBob works out cheerfully that this means another whole year in Mrs. Puff's class. That recasts the arrangement as something he might not entirely mind. Whether the rest of the run supports that reading is a separate question, since most of it suggests he wants the license badly. Animation historians have pointed out something that supports how central the arrangement was from early on. She was among the very first characters in the series, given episodes told from her own point of view. That is not the treatment a show gives a background obstacle. Load-bearing characters get that treatment, and it happened within the first 3 seasons. Her job description carries the same weight. Teaching and driving are the 2 things the show says she is good at, and it has established that she has successfully taught every student who has ever passed through that building. Everyone except one. The boating school is not a place where people fail. Everybody who walks through that door comes out with a license, and one student never does, and the one student is the main character. Almost everybody else in Bikini Bottom got different handling. Most recurring characters spend years as reliable furniture, wheeled in for a scene and wheeled out again. Only a handful ever get an episode built around what they want. Mrs. Puff had 2 of them before the show reached its 100th episode. Both were about her wanting to be free of SpongeBob. Neither was about SpongeBob wanting anything at all. One thing has to be said honestly here, because it is the weakest link in the chain. No writer or storyboard artist on this show has ever gone on the record describing the boating test as a deliberate status quo device. In those words, in any interview or commentary track that survives, the document says what it says. The compromise is documented. The general principle is well understood in the industry. The direct quote from somebody in the room saying, "We keep him failing on purpose," does not appear to exist. What does exist is the pattern, and the pattern is unusually disciplined for a show with this many writers over this many years. Whenever SpongeBob gets close to a license, and he gets close more often than casual viewers remember, something removes it before the credits roll. Sometimes the removal arrives as a technicality nobody saw coming. Sometimes an authority figure turns up with a clipboard and a rule about parole. Sometimes Mrs. Puff tears the license in half in front of him. The method changes constantly. The outcome never changes once. That consistency across dozens of episodes and several changes of showrunner is the strongest evidence that the rule was real long before somebody typed it into a licensing document. Writers' rooms drift. Running gags get forgotten, contradicted, or quietly retired all the time in series that run this long. This one held for a quarter of a century, through a feature film era, through the death of the man who created it, and through spin-offs made by people who were children when the first episode aired. The document did not create the rule. It wrote down what everybody working on the show already understood. One scene in the 4th season shows what the rule costs her, and the show plays it as a throwaway. Fired from the school, free of him at last, Mrs. Puff has gone out to a field to paint. She says out loud that she feels serene now that she is away from that homicidal maniac. Then she notices a boat coming. She has about a second to react, and what she does with it is paint the boat the instructor and the inspector into her picture, screaming, before it runs her down. Everything about the arrangement sits in that one image. She got out. The show gave her a field, an easel, and roughly 40 seconds of peace, and then drove the machine straight through it, because the following week needed her back in the passenger seat. What makes that discipline more impressive is how little the show gains from it in any single episode. Nothing about a given week would be worse if SpongeBob passed at the end of it. Plenty of long-running series have handed their protagonist a win and then found new problems for them. Holding the line for 25 years cost the writers something every time, and they held it anyway. That is how you can tell the decision was made somewhere above the writing room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Settling that argument produced the strangest design in the entire show. The woman who voiced her had already spent 35 years on stage before she ever sat in a recording booth. Her husband appears exactly once across the whole series, and he is not alive by the time the audience meets him. Section 3. The pufferfish, who was built to be an airbag. Mrs. Puff is a porcupine pufferfish, and Steven Hillenburg chose that species for one reason. He wanted the audience thinking about a car airbag every single time she inflated. Once that lands, the show becomes difficult to watch the same way again. She is not a teacher who happens to be a pufferfish. She was never designed as one. She is a piece of automotive safety equipment that has been given a name, a house, a job, and a personality, and then handed to the worst driver in the ocean. In the design logic of the show, the inflation is the character performing the function she was built for. Every crash calls her body into service, the way an impact calls an airbag out of a steering column, and the show has been running that joke since before most of its current audience was born. Hillenburg sold the whole idea to the network with a 3-panel comic. It showed Mrs. Puff attempting to teach SpongeBob to drive, and SpongeBob putting the boat straight into a rock. The executives found it funny enough to approve the character, and the series was greenlit not long afterward. A quarter of a century of television came out of 3 drawings of a crash. The rest of the setting follows the same logic. Her school is a submerged lighthouse with a stunt driving course laid out around it, which is a strange thing to install at a facility for beginners, and a very sensible thing to install if the point is that somebody will eventually be thrown through it. The building and the obstacle course are both, in the end, things for a boat to hit. Her full name is Penelope Puff, though the show has also used Poppy. Neither version comes up very often, because almost nobody in Bikini Bottom addresses her as anything other than her surname. The voice completes the design. When she puffs up, her register drops about an octave into something noticeably deeper and stranger, so the performance is half sound effect. That performance belongs to Mary Jo Catlett, and she came to it after a career most animation voice actors would consider a full life's work already. Born in Denver on the 2nd of September in 1938, she made her off-Broadway debut in 1963 in a melodrama at the Mermaid Theater. The following year, she originated the role of Ernestina in the Broadway production of Hello, Dolly, which is not a small credit in her world. What came after that is a working actor's resume rather than a star's. Los Angeles Drama Critics Circle Awards in 1978 and again in 1980, a Daytime Emmy nomination in 1990, an Ovation nomination for a featured performance in a musical in 1995. Television audiences of a certain age knew her face long before they knew her voice, because she spent years playing the housekeeper Pearl Gallagher on a sitcom that ran through most of the 1980s. She was the 3rd housekeeper that show hired. She is also, by some distance, the oldest member of the SpongeBob main cast. The part has followed her into everything the franchise has built since. She voices Mrs. Puff in the films. She voices her in the games. When Nickelodeon made a prequel series about the characters as children at summer camp, she came back and played the same woman decades younger. On Broadway, somebody else wore the costume and did the voice for 327 performances while Catlett was still recording the original. Hillenburg had seen her perform on stage. When the show needed a voice for the character he had invented to settle an argument with executives, he went looking for her specifically rather than holding an open casting call. Her first official session as Mrs. Puff happened in late August of 1998, almost a full year before the episode that introduced the character reached the air. The way that session worked says something about how the early show was made. She cut her dialogue in a single booth alongside Tom Kenny and Bill Fagerbakke, all 3 recorded together, in one room. Recording that way is older and more difficult, and it produces performances sounding like conversations rather than assembled parts. Recording an ensemble together means the performers can interrupt each other, overlap, react in real time, and adjust a line because of something somebody else just did with theirs. Cutting each actor separately came later and became the industry standard because it is cheaper, easier to schedule, and produces cleaner audio. Nobody in charge of a budget ever measured the cost in slightly deadened conversations. The early SpongeBob has an unusual amount of air in it, and a large part of that comes from 3 people standing in the same room at the same time. For the first 7 seasons, she voiced exactly one character and nothing else. Most performers on a show this size end up playing half a dozen people, partly because it is cheaper for the production, and partly because a performer who who can do several voices is more useful in a booth. 7 years on a single pufferfish is a mark of how much material the character was given, and of how specific the sound had to be. The whole performance turns on one switch, between her ordinary register and the deep voice that arrives when she inflates. From the 8th season onward, she picked up granny tentacles and a handful of background fish. For the better part of a decade, though, her entire relationship with the show was one pufferfish. She and Hillenburg were close friends until his death. Precision matters on the recognition, because this is exactly the kind of fact that gets repeated wrongly. At the 29th Annie Awards, covering 2001, she was nominated for voice acting by a female performer in an animated production. She was nominated. She did not win that year. Anybody who says Mary Jo Catlett holds an Annie Award for playing Mrs. Puff has read a bad summary somewhere and repeated it. Tom Kenny was nominated the same year, which makes the two of them the first members of the SpongeBob cast ever put up for anything at all. That detail says something about how the industry read the show in its second year. The two performances the animation world singled out first were the lead and the driving instructor. The boating school material was landing with professionals long before it became the running joke everybody quotes. Then there is her husband, and this is where a children's cartoon does something deeply unpleasant in about 4 seconds of screen time. Mr. Puff appears exactly once across the entire run, in a 3rd season episode about Mrs. Puff dating Mr. Krabs. The show cuts away to explain what happened to him, and the shot it cuts to is live-action footage dropped into the middle of the animation. Human divers caught him at some point. He has been made into a novelty lamp with a pull switch hanging from the bottom of him, sitting on a table in somebody's house, a long way from the ocean. Nothing about that scene is played for horror, and the episode moves on immediately. The implications sit there anyway. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs are in the room when it happens, and the episode is about the two of them beginning to date. So the lamp arrives inside a story about her moving on. A man is taking her out to dinner. Somebody asks the obvious question about her husband, and the answer is a photograph of a dead animal wired for electricity in a stranger's living room. The choice of live action is what makes it land. The series had spent 3 seasons establishing a world where everything is drawn and everything is soft. Cutting to a photograph of a real object in a real room breaks that completely for about 4 seconds, and the break is the joke. Whatever happened to Mr. Puff happened outside the cartoon, in a place the cartoon cannot protect anybody from. Mrs. Puff is a pufferfish. Pufferfish are taken out of the water by divers, dried and sold as lampshades in coastal gift shops, and this really happens in the real world. The show did not invent a fantasy death for her husband. It looked at what gets done to her species and put a photograph of it on screen. SpongeBob mentions in passing that she does not like to talk about it. That remark is the only acknowledgement the series has ever offered that any part of this might be difficult for the woman it happened to. All of it adds something to every scene she is in afterward. Her husband was killed by an outside force she could do nothing about. His body was turned into a household object. She now spends every working day in the passenger seat of a boat, driven by somebody who repeatedly puts her in hospital. Her impatience reads completely differently once that is established. Her eventual willingness to shout at a small yellow sponge starts looking like the behavior of a woman carrying more than anybody around her has noticed. Other things about her past have been planted and never explained, and they need labeling carefully because the internet has turned them into confident theories they do not quite support. A 2nd season episode drops a reference to her having changed her name at some point without ever explaining when or why. In a later episode, a viewer who pauses the picture at the right moment can read a newspaper in the background. The headline concerns a deranged boat teacher making a getaway, with a smaller line underneath about distracting the authorities using balloon animals. That paper carries a date in the 3rd week of October for anyone willing to squint at it. Both of those are Easter eggs and never plot. No episode has ever confirmed that Mrs. Puff has a criminal history predating the series. No writer has ever explained what the newspaper is doing in the background of that shot. What the show did was leave 2 small pieces of evidence lying around for the kind of viewer who freeze frames backgrounds. None of that establishes a backstory. The honest version is to describe the prop, say where it was found, and let the audience decide what to do with it. What is certain is the shape of the design, and the design is bleaker than the show's reputation suggests. None of that bleakness sits on the surface, and the early seasons pulled that trick constantly. A child watching this episode sees a funny lamp and a teacher being embarrassed about her dating life. A parent watching the same 4 seconds sees a widow whose husband was killed and sold as an ornament, sitting across from a man who is about to take her out for dinner. That double layer is most of the reason the show survived long enough to have a 25-year running gag at all. It also explains why the boating test material aged the way it did. A joke about a bad driver is funny to a child and thin to an adult. A joke about a widowed woman trapped in a job that keeps putting her in hospital is thin to a child and funnier to an adult. The same 20 minutes can be both, depending entirely on who is watching. A character invented to satisfy a network note became a woman built out of a crash safety device, married to a man who ended up as a lamp, employed permanently to sit beside somebody who cannot be allowed to improve. Before we move on, if If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In the summer of 2012, the show walked her across a line that comedy usually protects its antagonists from, in front of the largest audience it could assemble that year. More than a decade later, the fan base has still not let anybody forget it. Section 4. The day the teacher tried to kill him. Mrs. Puff drove a monster truck into an arena in July of 2012. She chased her own student across it, in front of a crowd, screaming a question at him about why he was still alive. The episode is called Demolition Doofus. It belongs to the 8th season, and a large part of the audience has never forgiven it. It reached American television on the 21st of July that year, inside a sports-themed marathon Nickelodeon ran to line up with the Olympics. Derek Iverson, Luke Brookshire, and Mark Ceccarelli share the writing credit. Vincent Waller was creative director on the series at the time. It pairs with a segment about Squidward inventing an illness to get out of work. The pairing gives it a lighter story to sit beside. Look down the casting sheet, and it is almost entirely the regulars doing extra jobs. Roger Bumpass plays Squidward, a doctor, an injured driver, and Captain Lutefisk, the man running the derby. Tom Kenny plays SpongeBob, a second injured driver, and a competitor called the Cruncher. Nobody was brought in from outside to stage an attempted murder. The same 6 people who make the show every week did it between them. The marathon slot matters a little, because an episode premiering inside a promotional event is being pushed hard. Nickelodeon put this one in front of the largest audience it could assemble that summer, alongside the opening episodes of a brand new season. It opens the way 100 other episodes have opened, with a driving test. For the first few minutes, there is nothing a regular viewer has not seen many times before. SpongeBob crashes, then he crashes again, then he keeps crashing, and Mrs. Puff inflates further with each impact in the ordinary way she always has. The difference arrives when the inflation does not stop. She expands so violently and so far past her usual limit that the pressure launches her off the ground entirely, sending her airborne across the water and into the side of the lighthouse at speed. When she comes down, something inside her has broken permanently. The show is unusually specific about what. A doctor explains that her inflation sac has ruptured beyond repair. She will never be able to puff again. The single physical characteristic the character was designed around, the airbag reflex Hillenburg built the whole species choice on, is taken away from her in the first act by the student who has been destroying her property since 1999. What SpongeBob says next is the moment a large part of the audience turned on the episode. Looking at his deflated teacher in a hospital bed, he offers the opinion that she looks better this way. Then he makes a joke about her name no longer fitting, since a fish who cannot puff is really more of a pop. Nothing about the delivery frames it as a slip of the tongue. He is visibly pleased with himself for having thought of it. She takes hold of his nose in a rage the animation plays as frightening, and hospital staff sedate both of them. Everything after that is a plan. Mrs. Puff enters SpongeBob into a demolition derby run by a character called Captain Lutefisk. She gives him a sock to wear on his head and the competitor name La Squish. Then she sends him into an arena full of heavy vehicles driven by people trying to destroy each other. The details of that setup are worse than the summary. She names him herself. She dresses him herself. He goes into the arena delighted because somebody he has spent 13 years trying to impress has finally taken an interest in something he is doing, and he has no idea what the interest is for. The other competitors have names like the Cruncher. He has a sock. The episode does not leave her motive ambiguous or hand the audience any room to decide for themselves. She is quite plainly hoping that he dies in there. Then the show delivers the one properly clever idea in the whole episode. Her plan fails for precisely the same reason he has never once passed a driving test. SpongeBob is a sponge. That makes him a soft invertebrate with no skeleton, no rigid frame, and nothing inside him a collision can break. Vehicles built to destroy other vehicles arrive, compress him, and leave him exactly as he was. His terrible driving keeps steering him directly into the path of machines that cannot hurt him, and he wins the entire derby by being impossible to damage. Everything that makes him a hazard on open water makes him unkillable inside an arena. That inversion is the one part of Demolition Doofus belonging in the good version of this episode. The show had been sitting on the physical facts of his body since 1999 without ever putting them to this use. Turning a character's central weakness into the thing that saves his life is a real idea, executed cleanly. In the middle of a story, most of the audience wishes had never been made. Whatever else is wrong with those 11 minutes, somebody in that room was thinking properly about who SpongeBob physically is. At that point, Mrs. Puff stops planning and simply starts acting. She takes a monster truck. She drives it into the arena herself. She chases him across it in the open, in front of a crowd, screaming a question at him about why he is still alive. Nothing in 25 years of this show comes close to that line. Everything else the character has done, including the jail sentences and the exhaustion and the flashes of temper, can be read as a woman under enormous pressure, behaving badly. Driving a truck at a student while demanding to know why he has not died yet is not a reading anybody has to work at. The chase ends with both of them crashing into the boating school, which collapses on top of the pair of them. Then the episode quietly restores her inflation sac with no explanation of any kind, and returns everything to normal well before the credits roll. That restoration is the most revealing 30 seconds in the whole episode, and almost nobody talks about it. The show spent an entire act establishing that her defining physical trait was gone permanently. It built its plot out of her reaction to losing it. Then it handed the trait back without a line of dialogue explaining how. Permanence was never on the table. It could not be, because a Mrs. Puff who cannot puff is a different character, and the following week needed the old one. One small piece of housekeeping sits underneath all of this, and it trips people up constantly, depending on which database somebody consults. Demolition Doofus is either the 21st episode of Season 8 or the 41st of Season 9. Nickelodeon aired the back half of Season 8 across a stretch that most listings later reorganized, and the DVD order and the broadcast order never agreed afterward. Anybody who has argued with somebody else about which season this episode belongs to was probably reading a different list. The reaction was severe, and it has not softened much with time. Audience scores sit far below anything else in the era. The rating on the main film and television database sits at 4.5 out of 10, and the score on the largest SpongeBob fan review site falls below 3. Several of the biggest animation critics on video platforms have placed it inside their worst episode lists, with one ranking it 5th worst and another placing it 3rd. Those lists matter more for this show than they would for most. SpongeBob has an unusually organized and unusually vocal community of adult viewers who grew up with the early seasons and have spent years cataloging exactly where they think it went wrong. A poorly received episode of most cartoons simply disappears. A poorly received episode of this one gets a decade of video essays, forum threads, and ranked lists devoted to explaining the failure in detail. The objections cluster around two things. The first is straightforward subject matter, since an attempted murder played for laughs in a children's cartoon sits a considerable distance outside anything the show had attempted before. The second is a word fans of long-running series use constantly, describing a character's defining trait being exaggerated across seasons until nothing else is left. Mrs. Puff had spent 13 years being tired and short-tempered. This episode converted that into something the audience describes as cold-blooded. SpongeBob does not escape the criticism either. The version of him here mocks a woman in a hospital bed about an injury he caused, and that sits awkwardly against a character whose defining quality across the entire series is that he means well and cannot help it. The distinction matters because the show has always been willing to let SpongeBob cause enormous damage without ever letting him be cruel about it. He wrecks the school constantly, and he is always devastated afterward. Standing at a hospital bed making a joke about somebody's ruptured body is a different register entirely, and the audience noticed the difference immediately, even where they could not name it. A defense exists, and it deserves stating properly, because a real part of the fan base has argued it consistently for over a decade. Mrs. Puff has been arrested repeatedly because of this student. Her school has been destroyed more times than anybody has counted. She has been hospitalized, jailed, put on parole, and physically injured by the same person for over a decade of story time. Every single time, the system has returned him to her classroom and told her to try again. Read that way, the episode shows a character finally reaching the end of something the show had been building since 1999. Fan communities have a phrase for a character who behaves terribly while remaining sympathetic because of what has been done to them, and Mrs. Puff gets filed under it constantly in discussions of this episode. The reading holds up better than the criticism sometimes allows. The show really had spent 13 years documenting exactly the sort of accumulated damage that produces a person driving a truck at somebody in an arena. A softer version of this story exists, and it shows that somebody involved had reservations. A book adaptation published afterward changes her motive. It drops the murder entirely and reframes the derby as an attempt to frighten SpongeBob badly enough that he would quit the school on his own. Somebody, at some point in the process, looked at the original and decided it needed a floor under it. The most revealing thing about Demolition Doofus is not the murder attempt at all. The episode takes away the one physical trait that defines her. It lets her lose control entirely and has her openly try to kill somebody in front of witnesses. Then it hands the inflation back and returns her to the classroom, inside the same 11 minutes. Nothing carries over. The following week, she is teaching again, and he is failing again. Whatever happens inside the machine is stronger than all of it. That is what a running gag means once it has run this long. Characters can be broken, hospitalized, arrested, and driven to attempted murder inside a single episode, and none of it survives contact with the following week, because the format was never built to carry consequences from one story into the next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Attempted murder is where the pattern arrives after 13 years of pressure. It starts somewhere far more ordinary, in the oldest rule in the book about who answers when something goes wrong on somebody else's watch. That rule has put her in a cell more often than most of the actual criminals in her town. Section 5. The teacher keeps going to prison. Mrs. Puff has been arrested at least 6 times across the run of this show. Exactly once was it her own doing. The first of them lands in August of 1999, less than a month after after the boating school appeared on television at all. Hall monitor, from the tail end of that month, puts SpongeBob in charge of hall monitor duty at the boating school. The assignment goes about as well as anything else he has ever been trusted with. By the end of it, the town is in a state of emergency over a rampaging maniac who turns out to be him. The police arrive in numbers. Mrs. Puff, asked to account for what has happened, makes the mistake of telling them he was her responsibility. That is technically true and legally catastrophic in equal measure. She is arrested on the spot. The following day, she teaches her class over closed-circuit television from inside a jail cell. The episode gets its final joke out of her telling SpongeBob she would like to see him after class in about 6 months. The scene is played lightly, and the implication is not light at all. A woman is now serving a custodial sentence for something a student did while wearing a hat she gave him. Establishing that in the first season set the terms of the relationship before the audience had time to form any other idea about it. Whatever SpongeBob does, Mrs. Puff pays for it. Run the episodes in sequence, and the imbalance becomes the loudest thing in the room. He crashes, apologizes, and turns up cheerfully the following week with no memory of any consequence, because none of the consequences have ever landed on him. She loses her building, her freedom, her income, and eventually her ability to inflate. Every one of those losses traces back to somebody who is never held responsible for causing them. The show did not arrive at that arrangement gradually, across seasons of escalation. The whole shape of it was there in August of 1999. Fans who count these things put the crowd of officers surrounding SpongeBob in the climax at somewhere around 60 individually drawn police, which for a first-season cel-animated cartoon is a considerable afternoon for whoever had to ink them. That figure comes from the audience rather than from the studio, and it should be held loosely. The second arrest, 2 seasons later, is the only one where she brings it on herself, and the funniest and bleakest of the set. No Free Rides, from April of 2001, is where Mrs. Puff decides she has had enough and passes him. The exam is the last of the year. His score is 6 out of a required 600. She signs off on it anyway, purely to get him out of her classroom permanently. Then she goes home and thinks about what she has just released onto the roads. Her parents buy him a boatmobile to celebrate. At that moment, the arrangement stops being paperwork and turns into a vehicle sitting outside his house with his name on the plate. Mrs. Puff watches it arrive. The panic that follows is the most human thing the character ever does. She pictures the town in ruins. She works out that she has personally put him on public roads and that she is the one who will be asked about it. She decides she has to take the boat back. So she puts on a ski mask, steals his new boatmobile in the middle of the night, and immediately crashes it into a police car. Only somebody who has not slept in several days makes that sequence of decisions. She goes to prison for it. She is released early on the condition that she returns to teaching him for free. The detail about teaching for free turns a joke into something sharper. The terms of her release send her back to the same position and specifically strip her of payment for the work that caused the problem in the first place. A court looked at a woman who had been driven to theft by a student, decided the appropriate remedy was more of that student, and removed her wages as a condition of getting out. Nothing in the episode presents that as an injustice. The show moves past it inside a few seconds. Comedy of that kind depends entirely on speed. Holding the shot for another beat would turn the joke into a complaint. The episode states the terms, gets its laugh from the absurdity of them, and moves on before anybody has time to work out how bleak the arrangement is. That lightness is precisely what makes it sit oddly for anybody paying attention, because a sentence like that would be the entire plot of a different program. Here, it is a punchline that clears the board and returns both characters to the classroom in time for next week. Read as a sequence of decisions, rather than a driving story, that episode turns into a fairly precise joke about institutions. She follows the rules for years and gets nowhere. She breaks them once, trying to protect the public from a danger she personally created, and the system punishes her for the attempt while ignoring the danger entirely. A woman does the correct thing for years without reward, does the wrong thing once for the right reason, and is punished for the second while nobody ever acknowledges the first. The third stops being funny if you sit with it too long. Doing Time, from January of 2002, opens with a crash whose consequences reach a retirement home, and Mrs. Puff is charged and jailed again. What the episode does with that is very strange for a children's cartoon. She starts enjoying prison. The joke has nothing to do with her being tough. Prison is simply a place where SpongeBob is not. For the first time in years, nobody is asking her to get into a boat with him. She settles into the routine and makes the best of a situation that is, by any measure available to her, better than the one she left behind. Then SpongeBob and Patrick decide to break her out, which she has not asked for and does not want. Their attempts include a failed bank robbery, disguising themselves as rocks, hiding inside a pot of chili, and impersonating guards. The sequence ends with Mrs. Puff pulling at the faces of 2 real guards in the belief that they are her friends in masks, which lands her in solitary confinement. The final turn reveals the whole thing has been a nightmare she keeps waking up inside, looping back to the beginning each time. The episode closes with her giving up on the idea of escaping the loop at all. That ending is far darker than the tone of the episode around it, and it is the closest the series has come to describing the running gag from inside her head. A loop she cannot leave. A loop loop that resets whenever she gets close to the edge of it. A loop populated by somebody who keeps arriving to help in ways that make everything worse. That is not a bad summary of what it is like to be a supporting character in a show that runs for 25 years. The remaining arrests arrive faster and with much less ceremony. Summer Job has her charged with littering. Potato Puff puts her inside for indirect responsibility once the destruction gets wide enough to need somebody to answer for it. A couple more take her away without ever bothering to show the cell. Oral Report is the one that states the principle out loud. The arresting officer explains that the boating instructor is responsible for any minor delinquent actions committed under that teacher's care. Nobody in the episode disputes it. That sentence is the whole arrangement in one line, delivered as a throwaway by a policeman. The episode called Patrick Mann is the bleakest of the minor ones, because she has not done anything at all. Patrick, playing at being a superhero, spots her apparently breaking into a boatmobile and turns her in. She was helping one of her own students who had locked himself inside and could not get out. Her reward for that is an arrest. One of them stands out because it has nothing to do with SpongeBob at all. In Ditchin, from late November of 2008, Mrs. Puff is arrested for skipping jury duty. That is the only time in the entire series she is punished for something entirely her own doing that does not involve a sponge, a boat, or a lighthouse. The construction of that episode is neater than the gag needs to be, because it runs one piece of advice through two completely different situations at once. She tells SpongeBob never to ditch, meaning her own obligation to appear in court. He receives it as guidance about attending school. Both of them are talking about avoidance, and neither is talking about the same thing, and the episode gets its entire plot out of the gap. Counting them properly is harder than it sounds, and the honest total is higher than most viewers would guess. Across the run, she is shown inside a cell in 5 episodes and arrested without a cell shown in 4 more. 9, in other words, and one of the 5 turns out not to have happened. The show never treats the record as continuous, and no episode has ever acknowledged that she has been through this before. Each arrest arrives as though it were the first one. A viewer watching in order accumulates the pattern. The characters inside the show never do. That gap between what the audience knows and what the characters know is the quiet engine under this entire running gag. Everybody watching has seen the school destroyed dozens of times and can recite the sequence before it happens. Long-running comedy depends on that arrangement more than almost anything else, because the pleasure of a running gag lives entirely in the anticipation. Nobody watching a boating episode is waiting to find out whether he crashes. They are waiting for the particular shape this week's crash takes and how much of the building survives it. Everybody inside Bikini Bottom is meeting the situation fresh, every single week, with no memory of the last time and no reason to expect anything different. Sitcoms have run on that imbalance since the form existed, and it is why a joke can be told hundreds of times without wearing out. The audience is not laughing at the surprise. No surprise is left anywhere in it. They are laughing at the gap between what they can see coming and what the people on screen still cannot. One last arrest closes a circle that had been open for 13 years. In Bumper to Bumper, from late 2012, SpongeBob finally passes a driving test properly, cleanly, boat undamaged, nothing on fire. A police officer then voids the result on a technicality nobody in the episode saw coming. Mrs. Puff was under house arrest at the time and had crossed a county line in order to administer the test, which means she was violating the terms of her parole for the whole duration of it. The officer takes the card out of his hands and tears it up in front of him. Then she is taken away, shouting across the water that she will get him for this, and that is the last the audience hears from her in that episode. Assembled into a single line, the record starts to read as a case file. Mrs. Puff has been jailed or arrested for a student's rampage, for a moment of panic caused by her own exhaustion, for littering, for missing jury duty, for indirect responsibility once the destruction got wide enough to need somebody to answer for it, and for teaching while on parole. The retirement home flood belongs on the list with an asterisk, since the episode pulls the cell out from under her at the end and reveals it as a loop she is dreaming. Every entry carries a date, an episode, and a stated charge. The whole sequence covers a period longer than most people spend building a career. In almost every case, the sentence follows from an event SpongeBob set in motion. In almost every case, the resolution returns her to the same classroom with the same student and no protection of any kind. At no point across 25 years has the show suggested she might be given a different job, a transfer to another school, or any form of assistance from anybody. The machine needs her exactly where she is, so exactly where she is remains where she stays. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything so far reads as a story about somebody who simply cannot drive. The crashes suggest it and the arrests confirm it. The show has spent 25 years quietly proving the opposite. The clearest proof involves a book 7,000 pages long and one night of reading. Section 6. He memorized the whole history of boating and still failed. The book is called The History of All Boating Ever, and it runs to 7,400 pages. SpongeBob read the whole thing in one night. It made no difference at all to what happened next. Nautical Novice is the title, and it runs as the second second segment of the second episode of Season 6, built around a school trip to the Bikini Bottom Museum of Boating. That segment was the 200th the series produced. The ending is fairly played, and that needs saying, because the twist gets accused of coming from nowhere. Early on, while showing off, SpongeBob mentions that the museum is towed out to port once a year for cleaning. Nobody reacts. The information sits there for most of the runtime, doing nothing at all, and then it turns out to be the entire explanation. The segment was paired with a story about Mr. Krabs and a penny, and it was the first thing Derek Iverson ever wrote for the show. His reason for reading is preparation. He has decided that the way to impress Mrs. Puff on this trip is to know more than anybody else on the bus, and that she might hand him a license on the spot for it. The book itself gets one good joke. Its opening line announces that in the beginning, Neptune created the sail, which is the first sentence of Genesis with the names swapped. He finishes it at 1 minute to 8 the next morning, misses the bus by that minute, and catches up with it on foot. He arrives with a scale model of the HMS Pinafore as a gift and recites boating history at anybody standing near him, whether they have asked for it or not. Inside the museum, he keeps interrupting the tour to deliver the information Mrs. Puff was about to deliver herself. The montage that covers it is scored, for no reason the show ever explains, to the theme from a British radio sitcom about the Navy. Reading 7,400 pages in a night is obviously impossible, and the show never pretends otherwise. The exaggeration is doing something specific with that impossibility. It establishes that effort has never been the obstacle. Whatever stands between SpongeBob and a boating license cannot be fixed by working harder, because he has already demonstrated a capacity for work no reasonable person could match. His stated goal is specific and quietly sad. He wants the lamination on a fresh boating license, and he describes that lamination with the sort of longing most people reserve for a person. That detail is the kind of thing the show slipped past younger viewers constantly. The prize he has organized his life around is not the freedom to go anywhere or the ability to reach places he cannot currently reach, because he lives within walking distance of everywhere he goes. What he wants is the object, the physical card with the plastic on it, and the recognition that comes attached. Then the plot arrives the way plots usually arrive around him. He touches something he should not have touched, and the museum boat starts moving with everybody on board. What happens next is the closest the series has ever come to letting him be competent without cheating. Mrs. Puff panics and admits she has never driven anything this advanced. She pulls a lever and makes it worse. Then she tells him he is the only one who can stop it. He takes the wheel, he battens down the hatches, he lowers the anchor, finds it stuck, goes outside to free it by hand, comes back in, and performs something the episode calls a reverse 720 tail spin. The museum comes to a controlled stop before it reaches the town. Nobody is feeding him answers through a hat. Nobody has planted anything inside his skull. He read a book the night before, applied what was in it under pressure, and the thing he read worked. Mrs. Puff, standing there watching, does the thing the audience has waited 12 years to see her do. She moves to grant him the license. Then a tugboat operator surfaces alongside and explains that he had been towing the museum the entire time. The vessel was never under SpongeBob's control at any point. Every maneuver he performed was performed on a boat going wherever somebody else happened to be pulling it. He never really did anything at all, by the strict reading of it, and Mrs. Puff tears the license up on the spot in front of him. The episode does give him something, and the thing it gives him is oddly tender. The engineer, who has just accidentally destroyed his life's ambition without meaning to, pins an honorary sea legs badge on him for his bravery. Then he offers to take him out for ice cream. Kindness from a stranger lands a good deal harder than anything his own teacher has ever offered him. The badge is not a license, and everybody in the scene knows it. He gets it anyway. Mrs. Puff comes out of that episode worse than she goes in, and the show does not dwell on it. She had a signed way out of 13 years of this, and she tore it up herself, on a technicality, in front of him, seconds after handing it over. Nothing obliged her to. The tugboat man had not asked her to void anything. She simply could not certify a past that had not happened, and so she talked herself out of the one exit she has ever been offered. That contrast is not an accident, and the episode knows exactly what it is doing with it. A man who has never met SpongeBob before, who has no obligation to him, and no history with him, looks at somebody who has just lost the thing he wanted most, and decides to do something about it. The woman who has taught him for over a decade tore the license up. Nothing in the episode criticizes Mrs. Puff for that, and nothing needs to. The two responses sit next to each other in the same 3 minutes, and the audience can do the arithmetic. The structure of that failure is crueler than a simple crash would have been. The episode does not have him panic, or freeze, or drive into a building. It gives him a genuine success. It lets his teacher acknowledge it out loud. Then it removes the success on a technicality that has nothing to do with his ability. He was competent, and the competence did not count. Everybody who has sat an examination of any kind recognizes that shape immediately, because the machinery of testing does not measure whether somebody can do a thing. It measures whether they can be seen to do the thing, under approved conditions, with the correct paperwork attached. Those two questions come apart more often than anybody administering a test would like to admit. The museum episode is the cleanest statement of that that gap in the whole series. He performed correctly, the performance was real, and the boat really stopped. And because the conditions were not what everybody believed them to be, the correct performance counted for nothing. That distinction between knowing and doing is stated plainly in another 6th season episode where SpongeBob explains the situation himself. He always passes the oral portion. He never once passes the driving part. He says both halves of that in the same breath as a man reporting the weather. He is entirely aware of the pattern, has been aware of it since the first episode, and has no more idea what to do about it than his teacher does. Then there is a 7th season episode that turns the whole thing into a parody of something real, and it is the sharpest piece of satire the boating material ever produced. Boat Smarts is the title, and the whole thing is built as an instructional film narrated by Mrs. Puff in the flat, authoritative voice of every road safety reel ever shown to a room of bored teenagers. She introduces herself as a state-accredited boating instructor and announces that today they will be discussing the difference between a driver with boat smarts and a driver without. Safety films of that kind were a genuine fixture of American schooling for decades, shown in darkened classrooms, built around a contrast between the sensible driver who survives and the careless one who does not. The form is so recognizable that a parody barely has to exaggerate anything. This episode mostly does not bother copying the pacing, the narration, and the smug moral certainty almost exactly as they existed, right down to the pairing at the center. Squidward demonstrates correct behavior. The irresponsible driver is played by the obvious candidate. Each segment of the lesson is the same joke told twice. Tire pressure. Squidward fills his to the correct level, and SpongeBob overloads his until it explodes into Squidward. Buckling up. Squidward belts himself in and stops gently at a light, and SpongeBob arrives at speed and launches him into a spiked steamroller. Adjusting mirrors. Squidward does it before setting off, and SpongeBob does it while driving through pedestrians. Underneath all of it sits a joke about the sponsor. The film is brought to you, the narrator says, by an organization whose acronym runs to 26 letters. Spelled out, it stands for Citizens of Bikini Bottom United to Keep SpongeBob SquarePants off the road and out of boats altogether. That name confirms something the show rarely bothers to state. Everybody in town has independently reached the same conclusion about him. This is not Mrs. Puff being impatient or a single police officer holding a grudge. An entire population has organized, given itself a name, and started funding educational films with the specific goal of keeping one sponge away from the water. Mrs. Puff is listed as its leader, which puts her in an awkward position for a woman paid to teach him. Squidward is assumed to be a member, on the evidence of appearing in the film as the good example. Nobody else is named. This is also the first organized group the show ever formed in opposition to its own main character, and it would not be the last. What the parody adds to the form it is copying is that the reckless one here is not reckless at all in the ordinary sense. He is not speeding for fun. He is not ignoring the rules to impress anybody. He is the most rule-aware person in the entire film, and he still cannot be allowed near a boat, which makes the safety film useless as a safety film because nothing in it is anything he could learn. Genuine road safety campaigns run into a version of that problem constantly, since the people most likely to sit attentively through a warning are rarely the people the warning was made for. The reckless driver does not watch the film at all. The anxious rule follower watches it twice and comes away noticeably more anxious than before. By casting SpongeBob as the cautionary example, the episode quietly points at something uncomfortable about the whole format. The person held up as a warning to others may be the one least able to act on it. Set the 3 episodes alongside each other, and the argument the show has been making becomes hard to miss. He has read more about boating than anybody in Bikini Bottom. He can recite the rules, name the maneuvers, and execute them correctly on a vessel large enough to flatten a town. The examination he keeps failing does not measure any of that, and the show has never once suggested that passing it would make him a better driver. What it measures is whether he can do it while being watched, while being graded, while sitting next to a woman whose entire body is a crash reflex, on a course surrounded by everything he has already destroyed. None of those conditions get easier with practice, and several get worse. Every additional failure adds another crash to the history sitting on that course, another repair to the building, another entry on the record of the woman in the passenger seat. The examination he sits in the 20th season is objectively harder to pass than the one he sat in the first, and nothing about the test itself has changed. Anybody who has failed a driving test more than once recognizes that accumulation. The second attempt carries the memory of the first, and the fourth carries all 3 before it. Nothing about that gets said out loud in the show, and it does not have to be, because a viewer who has sat in that particular seat brings the feeling into the episode with them. A cartoon about a sponge crashing a boat gets to borrow the anxiety of every person who has ever pulled away from a curb while somebody with a clipboard watched them do it. Borrowed feeling is the cheapest and most reliable material any comedy has access to. The writers never had to build the tension in those scenes because the audience arrived carrying it. All the show needed to supply was a sponge, a boat, and a woman in the passenger seat holding a pen. What began as a straightforward assessment of whether somebody can operate operate a vehicle turns into an assessment of whether they can operate a vehicle while carrying every previous failure into the seat with them. No examiner has ever found a way to test only the first thing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A gag this old survives by getting close to breaking and never quite breaking. The writers have handed him a license more often than most viewers remember, and on one of those occasions he was asleep at the time. Section 7. Every time he almost made it, SpongeBob has held a boating license in his hands 6 separate times across 25 years. 6 separate times the show has taken it back before the credits rolled. What makes the run remarkable is that no two of those removals work the same way. The first happens earlier than almost anybody remembers, in the last episode of the first season to enter production, broadcast in the middle of January in 2000. Sleepy Time is the title, and he is asleep for the whole of it. Somewhere inside the dream, he is finally holding the license. The show even displays the card, close enough to read. What it says is a small disaster all of its own. The birth date printed on the dream license puts him in 1942, which would make him a pensioner. Every later version of the same card, in episodes where he is awake, gives a birthday in July of 1986. Nobody has ever reconciled the two. He is holding the thing he has wanted since the show began, in the only place nobody can take it from him, and the prop is already contradicting itself. Dreams in this series are usually generous places, and that is exactly what makes this one stand out. Other characters get flying, wealth, revenge, and every other thing the waking world refuses them, and the show plays those sequences as a release. This is the one occasion where the dream is invaded, and the invasion is played for a laugh. Mrs. Puff appears inside the dream and tears the license up in front of him, telling him no, not even here. The scene makes no attempt whatsoever to explain how she has entered somebody else's sleep, or why the rules of the waking world would follow her in. Something important gets established there, on roughly the 15th episode the show ever produced. Before the series had finished its first year, the writers had already decided that the failure is not situational, not a matter of practice, not a matter of nerves. Failing is closer to a permanent condition of his existence than a problem sitting in front of him. Establishing that early gave the show enormous freedom later, because a gag with no possible resolution can be pointed in any direction without breaking. If SpongeBob could plausibly pass next week, every boating episode would be building towards something and would owe the audience progress. Once passing became structurally impossible, each episode could be about whatever it wanted. The outcome was never in question, and nobody was waiting for it. He cannot pass in reality, and he cannot pass in a dream, and the show found that funny enough to build a scene around before most of the audience had settled into watching it. The second occasion is the only time he is handed a license by the proper authority through the proper channel. It happens in the episode where his teacher finally breaks. She passes him with 6 points out of a required 600, purely to be rid of him, and for a few hours he is a legally licensed driver in Bikini Bottom. That one gets removed by her own panic. She steals the boat back, crashes into a police car, and goes to prison, and the license goes down with her. The method in that instance is guilt. The person who granted it looked at what she had released onto the water and decided the public could not survive the consequences of her own decision. The third is the museum episode, where he earns the thing properly and then loses it to a tugboat operator who had been towing the whole vessel the entire time. The method there is a technicality in the purest available sense. Nothing about his actual performance changed at the moment the truth arrived. The only thing that changed was the paperwork describing it. Strangest of the 6 is the 4th, which belongs to a 9th season episode where the variable is trousers. SpongeBob puts on long pants. He discovers they make him feel like an adult, and the confidence carries him through the driving test without difficulty. The license he walks away with is real, and it is issued through all the correct channels. Then he changes back into short trousers, and the license is taken away from him again. The show is stating out loud something about the character it usually prefers to leave implied. His competence is not a skill he lacks at all. Competence is a state he can occasionally enter and cannot hold, and a pair of trousers turns out to be as reliable a way in as anything else he has tried. That reads as pure nonsense until somebody thinks about how confidence behaves in a person. Plenty of people drive better in a car they feel comfortable in, interview better in a particular jacket, and perform better under conditions that have no logical relationship to the task at all. What the episode exaggerates is something real, and the exaggeration is funnier because the underlying observation holds. The 5th and the ones around it are easier to miss, because the card turns up more often than the story does. Across the run, SpongeBob's license appears 9 separate times. Twice in the early seasons, once in the museum, once in a 6th season episode about him vanishing from Bikini Bottom entirely, once in a 9th season episode built around a board game, once inside a virtual reality sequence, and once as a bubble. None of them stick. What the count establishes is that the writers kept drawing the object. A prop department has produced that card, with his photograph and his address, and an expiry date printed on it, 9 times over, for a character the company has ruled can never keep one. Then there is the version of this joke where somebody else gets what he wants. In a 4th season episode, Patrick Patrick sits the same test, passes it first time, and arrives home with a new boatmobile. He spends the rest of the half hour being insufferable about it. SpongeBob, who has been at this for over a decade of story time, watches a starfish who has barely attended a class clear the thing in an afternoon. That is the only episode in the entire run where he is openly jealous rather than merely disappointed, and one of the very few where he actually cries about failing. What he does with the jealousy is worse than the jealousy. He tears Patrick's license up and throws the pieces out of a moving boat, and the pieces land in the hand of a police officer, and Bikini Bottom turns out to treat littering with a seriousness it has never once applied to destroying a building. Patrick is chased, tried, and given 90 days. SpongeBob confesses and serves the sentence in his place. So the one episode where somebody in that classroom finally passes ends with the license destroyed anyway by SpongeBob, and with SpongeBob in a cell for it. The show cannot let anybody keep one of these things, not even the starfish. Last of them is the one that hurts, and it belongs to another 9th season episode broadcast in the closing weeks of 2012. SpongeBob takes the test that week and simply passes it. No trick, no interference from anybody. He does not crash into anything. He does not panic behind the wheel. The boat comes back without a scratch on it, and by every measure the examination was designed to apply, he has met the standard set for him. Mrs. Puff has spent the episode using increasingly extreme methods to break his fear, and against all expectation the methods worked. Then a police officer arrives and voids the result. Mrs. Puff was under house arrest at the time and had crossed a county line in order to administer the test. She was violating her parole for the entire duration of the examination, which means the examination itself was never valid, which means his clean pass evaporates on a piece of administrative law that has nothing to do with him. She is taken away shouting across the water that she will get him for this, and the whole arrangement resets in time for the following week. 6 removals across 25 years then, and a different mechanism for every one of them. A dream invasion, a guilty theft, a tugboat that turned out to be doing the driving, a change of trousers, a prop that never survives its own episode, and finally somebody else's parole violation. Not one of those repeats another. Not one has anything in common with the rest. Somebody was deliberately finding a new route to the same destination every time rather than reusing the old ones. Most long-running shows handle the same problem by finding one reliable reset and using it until the audience stops noticing. The romance gets interrupted the same way every season. The promotion falls through for the same reason it fell through last time. Variety costs a writing room real effort and produces no obvious benefit, since the outcome is identical either way, and this one paid that cost for a quarter of a century. The status quo of a long-running series behaves like a rubber band rather than a wall, because a wall would be boring and nobody would watch it. Any individual episode can stretch the thing right to the edge of genuine change, and half the pleasure of watching a show this old is seeing how far the writers are willing to pull before letting go. What never happens is the band snapping. Nickelodeon's document, the one governing all of this, describes only the outcome. SpongeBob can never permanently receive the license. That instruction constrains almost nothing. Permanently is the only word in it doing any work. It does not say how the license goes, or by whose hand, or for what reason, and it does not require the failure to be SpongeBob's fault. A writing room handed that sentence has enormous freedom inside a single hard boundary, and rules shaped like that are generally the most productive kind a creative team gets. Constraints of that shape tend to produce better work than open briefs do, which most people outside creative industries find counterintuitive. Being told to write anything at all about a driving school produces the obvious episode. Being told the student must lose the license by the end, without being told how, forces somebody to invent a tugboat, a pair of trousers, and a hungry exchange student. Everything above is what that one sentence looks like when a writing room has to execute it for 25 years without repeating itself. What none of the 6 have in common is any suggestion that SpongeBob failed. In the dream he had it and lost it to somebody walking into his sleep uninvited. In the museum, he earned it and lost it to a boat he could not see from where he was standing. In the long trousers he passed and lost it to a change of clothing. In the last of them he passed cleanly and lost it to somebody else's court order. The show is careful about this in a way it did not have to be. It would have been easier to have him crash 6 times and lose the license 6 times through his own incompetence, and nobody would have complained. Instead, the writers kept handing it to him legitimately and then removing it through the world around him, which turns the running gag from a joke about a bad driver into something closer to a joke about luck. Luck is a much more sympathetic engine than incompetence, and it changes how the audience holds the character across decades. A person who keeps failing because they are bad at something eventually becomes tiresome to watch. A person who keeps succeeding and having the success removed by circumstances outside their control stays watchable more or less indefinitely because the audience is on their side rather than ahead of them. Sympathy is the resource a running gag spends, and it is finite. Every joke at a character's expense draws a small amount from it. Every moment of genuine unfairness puts some back. A show that only withdraws eventually runs the account down. That is what audiences mean mean when they say a series has turned mean-spirited. This one kept putting something back every time it took something out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Counting the failures runs into a wall almost immediately. The show has given 3 different totals across 3 decades, and no 2 of them agree. The largest figure anybody has said out loud would take several thousand years of daily schooling to reach. Section 8, 37, or 1 million, or nobody knows nobody, in Bikini Bottom can say how many times SpongeBob has failed his boating test. The show has attached 3 different figures to it across 3 decades, and it broke its own count inside the first episode. The first figure is the one from that opening night in 1999, the 37 that Gary corrected to 38 before the sentence was finished. That was a joke about a number that would not sit still, and the show has been telling versions of it ever since. Each new figure is larger and less believable than the one before, and none of them can be reconciled with the rest. None of that is a continuity error somebody made in a hurry and nobody thought to catch. The joke is the number. The correction is the punchline. Underneath both of them sits a quiet fact about that first night, which is that Gary supplies the right figure without being asked. The snail has been counting. The person doing the failing has not. Whether that reads as loyalty or simply as record keeping is left entirely open. Small moments like that one are most of what made the early seasons work. Nothing about the sadness is stated, and all of it is available to anybody paying attention. The second number arrives 2 years later, in the episode where Mrs. Puff finally passes him out of desperation, and it works differently because it is a score. She reads out his final score, and the score is 6. SpongeBob starts celebrating before she has finished, because 6 sounds like a number worth celebrating until she supplies the missing half of it. 100, she says, finishing the number. He stops dead with his arms halfway in the air. 600 turns out to be the pass mark, and the score he walked away with was 6. The pause she puts on the pass mark before delivering it is the piece of performance that makes the whole exchange land. She says the number. She stops. She says the other half of it, and then confirms what he actually scored. That is the rhythm of somebody breaking bad news to a person who has not yet understood how bad it is. 6 out of 600 is 1%, which puts him below any plausible result a student could reach by guessing. Somebody filling in answers at random would have walked away with a better mark than the student who spent the year taking notes. What the number describes is a man who has managed to be wrong on purpose without meaning to. A specific kind of comedy lives in a score that low, and it depends on the audience understanding roughly how tests work. 0 would have been a joke about knowing nothing at all. 600 would have been a joke about impossible perfection. 6 is a joke about the existence of a scale, because it confirms the examination has hundreds of available points, and that SpongeBob found almost none of them. What he says next makes the whole running gag click into place. Failing, he tells her cheerfully, means he gets to spend another whole year in her class. Nobody anywhere in the episode treats that as a strange thing to be pleased about. He says it the way somebody announces good news. He slams his fist down in celebration and knocks a piece of the engine loose, which lands on Mrs. Puff and inflates her one last time before the scene ends. That line went out in 2001. Nickelodeon's own internal rule about the boating license, written down later, protects the same relationship from the other direction. Everybody quotes the third number. It turns up in a 4th season episode broadcast on the first day of April in 2006, in which Mrs. Puff loses her job over her failure to teach him properly. An inspector named Mr. Fitz states the total during that episode. He introduces himself as representing the Boating Teachers Accreditation Bureau, and the closed captions of the original broadcast misheard him and printed the Voting Teachers Accreditation Bureau instead. Nobody has ever corrected it. The total he gives is 1,258,056. The show does not present it as an exaggeration or a joke about record keeping. He delivers it in the flat voice of a man reading from a file. His first name never comes up in the dialogue. The closing credits give it as Gunther, and D. Bradley Baker plays him. He has arrived to renew Mrs. Puff's teaching certificate, finds the failure rate unacceptable, and does not accept her explanation that the entire figure belongs to one student who cannot be taught. Blame the teacher, he tells her, not the students. Then he fires her and installs a retired army sergeant in her place. What that sergeant does with the school is the part of the episode people forget. He breaks the door down, introduces himself to the room as worthless students, and throws one child out for talking and another for eating. The rest leave on their own. SpongeBob stays because SpongeBob always stays, which leaves the two of them alone with an obstacle course involving spikes and fire. The training works, and the way it works is the joke. SpongeBob is made to crawl the course, then walk it, then run it, then drive it, and finally to drive it blindfolded. Blindfolded, he is flawless. Then he is told he cannot use the blindfold in the real examination because driving blindfolded is illegal in Bikini Bottom, and the whole thing collapses. He destroys a substantial portion of the town, ends up with Patrick's trousers over his eyes, and immediately parks the boat perfectly. Mr. Fitz fails him anyway, and rehires Mrs. Puff on the spot. Even the finest instructor available could not teach him, he says. Nobody in the show has ever come closer to apologizing to her. The visual that accompanies it is the best joke in the episode. Mr. Fitz flips through the folder while he says it, and the folder contains a photograph of SpongeBob for every single failure. Page after page of the same yellow face, grinning identically, going past at speed, for what the audience understands to be well over 1 million pages. That image does something the number alone cannot. It makes the total feel physical. A figure north of 1 million is abstract enough that it slides off the mind almost immediately. A folder somebody has to hold with both hands, containing a photograph for every attempt, is a thing an audience can look at and understand. The joke lands because somebody in the props department turned a statistic into an object. Placed against the figure from 1999, the arithmetic collapses. Somewhere between 38 attempts and 1.25 million attempts, roughly 7 years of broadcast time elapsed. Even at one examination every single day without a break, reaching that total would take something in the region of 3,500 years. SpongeBob would have been attempting his boating license since before the construction of most things anybody has heard of. Obviously, all of that is the joke, and it needs saying plainly before anybody starts building timelines. The show reached for the largest number that would still fit inside a sentence, attached it to a folder of photographs, and moved on without any expectation that somebody would sit down with a calculator afterward. What this means for anybody narrating the subject is simple and slightly disappointing. Nowhere in the whole series does a canonical count exist to point at with confidence. Two hard figures sit on screen and refuse to agree, being the 37 or 38 prior examinations from the first season and the 1 million odd total from the fourth. They cannot be reconciled because they were never written with each other in mind. Any video, article, or forum post confidently stating a single official number has picked one of the two and quietly discarded the other. Fan communities have spent years attempting to reconcile them anyway, building timelines that require SpongeBob to have been sitting the same examination since before the pyramids. The exercise is enjoyable precisely because it cannot be completed. SpongeBob himself offers a third framing inside that same fourth season episode, describing his attempts as somewhere around 1 million tries. That is dialogue color and should be treated as such. The paperwork around the license carries its own contradictions, and they multiply the longer anybody looks. His card expires on the 14th of December in 2003. That date holds across 4 separate episodes, and that is more consistency than this show usually manages. Then the disc labels for a later season box set print the same day, 7 years further forward, in 2010. A much later episode puts a bubble version of the license on screen, with an expiry in December of 2017. Birth dates are worse. Most versions of the card give a birthday in July of 1986, which would make him 13 years old in the first episode of the series and somewhere in his teens for the whole of the early run. The version glimpsed inside the dream gives 1942 instead. His address changes too, from one street to another, depending on which episode is holding the prop. The object has even escaped the show. In one of the franchise games, it exists as a breakable item, something a player can find and destroy. That is a fairly exact translation of what the series does to it every time. None of those details agree with each other, and none were ever meant to, because a cartoon that runs this long accumulates paperwork the way a house accumulates paint. Each layer was applied by somebody solving a problem in front of them, and nobody was checking what was already underneath. Nobody sat down and decided SpongeBob was born in 1986 and then changed their mind later. Somebody needed a birth date on a prop for a single frame in the first season, wrote one, and never thought about it again. Everything printed afterward was produced by people who had no reason to check. Every long-running series accumulates this, and most handle it by simply never mentioning the contradictions again. The alternative is maintaining a rigid internal record across decades and hundreds of writers, which would cost more than it could possibly return, and would mean refusing jokes because a date in season 2 makes them impossible. Almost every show chooses the joke. Almost every audience forgives it, right up until somebody makes a video about the discrepancies. Counting is the clearest example of something that runs through this whole subject. The audience wants the running gag to have a shape, a total, a record that can be examined and added up. The people making it wanted a laugh on a Tuesday afternoon and reached for whatever number sounded funniest in the room. Both of those are reasonable positions. Only one of them produces a straight answer. Escalating a number for comic effect works because the audience is quietly doing arithmetic without noticing. 38 is a lot of attempts at anything. 6 points out of 600 is worse than a lot because it proves a scale exists and that he found almost none of it. 1.25 million stops being a quantity altogether and turns into a description of a permanent condition. At that point, the joke stops being about failure and starts being about fate. A practical reason sits behind the growing numbers that has nothing to do with comedy theory. Each of those figures was written years apart by different people working on different seasons, none of whom were checking what the last one had established. A writer reaching for a funny number in 2006 had no particular reason to look up what somebody had said in 1999, and the show had never given anybody a reason to think it mattered. What can be said with confidence is narrower and more useful than a number. SpongeBob has failed this examination often enough that the total stopped being countable within the first season. His own household has kept a more accurate record of the failures than he has. The school keeps a file thick enough to need both hands. The file is the part of that scene that stays with people. Mr. Fitz has to hold it with both hands and flip through it while he talks, and the pages are photographs, every one of them showing the same yellow face in the middle of the same laugh. Whoever designed that prop understood that a number on a page means nothing, and a stack of identical faces means everything. Comedy of scale usually works that way. The mind stops registering a figure somewhere past a few thousand and starts treating it as an abstraction. Handing the audience an object they can see the size of does the work that no amount of zeros ever manages on its own. The count, then, is not a mystery the show is withholding, and it is not a continuity error somebody failed to catch. The count is a running joke about the impossibility of counting, told 3 times across 3 decades. The punchline each time is that the number is larger and less believable than the last one anybody offered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Underneath every number and every technicality sits the thing the show has circled since 1999 without ever landing on it. Something happens to SpongeBob at the exact moment a boat starts moving. The series has described it from about 6 directions and defined it from none of them. Section 9. What happens when the boat starts moving? Nobody in Bikini Bottom has ever diagnosed him. Across 25 years and several hundred episodes, no doctor names a condition, and no character offers an explanation with a label attached. The closest the series comes is a sentence SpongeBob says in the first boating episode and has never once revised. He knows every answer in the manual, he tells the room, and then he gets behind the wheel. That sentence does more than it appears to at first hearing. Ignorance is ruled out because he has the answers. Laziness is ruled out too. He has done all the preparation anybody could reasonably ask for. What the sentence describes is a threshold, a specific point at which a person who has everything he needs stops being able to use any of it, and the show placed that threshold at the moment the boat begins to move. Placing it exactly there was a deliberate choice, with consequences the writers would live with for decades. Putting the threshold at the classroom door would have made him afraid of school itself. Putting it at the examination would have made him afraid of being judged. Putting it at the moment of motion means the problem only exists while something is happening, and that is the one version that can be staged as physical comedy every single time. It also gives every boating episode the same reliable structure without the writers having to think about it. The calm before the engine starts, the moment of motion, the collapse, and the aftermath. That shape can hold a 2-minute cold open or an entire 11-minute story, and it works whether the tone of a given episode is gentle or unusually dark. One more thing follows from putting it there, and it is the reason the gag survives being told hundreds of times. The threshold is invisible until it is crossed. Nothing in the classroom predicts it. Nothing in his preparation predicts it. Every single episode gets to stage the same small suspense. The suspense lives in the couple of seconds between a boat starting and a boat leaving the course, and the audience never quite stops watching for it, even knowing exactly what is coming. He restates it years later in a 6th season episode. The oral portion has never been a problem. The driving portion has never been anything else. He is not confused about his own situation. He has been diagnosing himself accurately since the first season, and the accuracy of that self-diagnosis has not helped him even slightly. That last part is the cruel bit, and it is true of most people in his position. Understanding precisely what goes wrong is not the same as being able to stop it. He can name the moment, he can name the mechanism, he can tell a room full of people exactly which second of the examination he is going to lose, and then he goes out and loses it in that second. The closest the series ever comes to naming the thing arrives in a 9th season episode, where Mrs. Puff decides the problem underneath all of it is fear. SpongeBob is frightened of driving, she concludes, and the fear is what stands between him and a license, so she sets about breaking it. Her diagnosis is correct in the sense that it produces a result, because he does eventually pass that examination cleanly. That episode is also the only time in the entire run when anybody stopped to ask what is wrong with him instead of simply grading him on it. For a series with several hundred episodes and a central character defined by one repeated failure, that is a strange thing to be able to say. Everybody around him has treated the failure as a fixed property of the world, like weather, never as something with a cause worth investigating. One teacher, in one episode, in the 9th season, asked the question that had been sitting there since 1999, and the answer she arrived at turned out to be right. What she does with that answer is the part the episode gets wrong. Her methods escalate well past anything a professional would be permitted to attempt on a student. The diagnosis is sound. The treatment is closer to assault than to teaching. Both of those things being true in the same episode is a reasonably good summary of how the show has always handled her. No episode has ever attached a specific condition to any of this. The explanation the show works with is behavioral. It describes what happens and never theorizes about why, and it has held that line for a quarter of a century. The gap has been filled enthusiastically by audiences online, and the theories need mentioning alongside a clear statement that none of them are canon. People have proposed anxiety conditions, learning breathing difficulties, specific neurological explanations. None of them has ever been endorsed by the show. Anybody presenting those theories as established fact is presenting an interpretation. Staying out of it was probably a simpler decision than the theories suggest. Naming a condition would fix the character in place. It would attach obligations to how he is written, because a series cannot hand a character a specific diagnosis and then keep using the symptoms as a punchline. Leaving it unnamed keeps the comedy available. It also keeps the audience free to see whatever they recognize. Plenty of viewers have recognized something, and that is part of why the material has stayed alive online for so long. Some people freeze in examinations. Some know a subject thoroughly and cannot demonstrate it on demand. Some have sat in a car beside an instructor and felt a skill they definitely possess simply leave the building. They watch those episodes differently from somebody who has never experienced any of it. What the show gives those viewers is the one thing the situation itself never does. They get an audience that already knows he can do it. Nobody watching a boating episode thinks SpongeBob is bad at boating. The audience has seen the montage, the museum, and the blindfold. They are watching somebody fail at a thing they have been shown he can do. That is a considerably more sympathetic position than the one Mrs. Puff occupies inside the boat. The show does not tell them what they are looking at, and the recognition does the work instead. Leaving it open is a far more generous way to write a character than naming the thing would have been. A diagnosis on screen tells the audience who the character is. It also tells them who they are not. An unnamed pattern of behavior lets everybody who recognizes something in it keep their own version, and lets everybody else watch a sponge crash a boat. One thing has to sit alongside all of this, because the show does not consistently frame him as a victim, and the balance matters if the picture is going to be honest. In the episode where Mrs. Puff passes him out of sheer desperation, her immediate reaction is to imagine the whole town in ruins, and the episode plays that vision as a reasonable forecast rather than as paranoia. In the episode where she is jailed for a flood, the flood happened because of him. The boating school itself has been destroyed more times than anybody has ever bothered to record. A retirement home was flooded with fruit punch as the direct result of one driving exam going wrong. His teacher has been hospitalized repeatedly. She has been imprisoned at least 6 times. On one occasion, an entire town was shown a vision of itself in ruins as the direct consequence of him holding a license for a few hours. None of that reads as an unlucky student having a difficult time. All of it reads as a sustained pattern of destruction with one common factor running through every incident. The citizens who formed an organization specifically to keep him off the water had a point. Both readings are supported by the material, and the show has never chosen between them, which is part of why the gag has survived. Calling him a victim of an unfair system leaves too much out. Calling him a menace leaves out more. He wants a thing badly, works harder for it than anybody around him, and leaves a trail of genuine wreckage behind while doing so. And all three hold at the same time. Very few children's cartoons manage to hold a character in that many positions simultaneously, and fewer still do it for 25 years without collapsing into one reading or another. Most long-running characters lose that complication over time. Hundreds of different writers sand them down into something simpler and faster to work with. Holding 2 incompatible readings at once is something long-running comedy does far more often than it admits, and it is usually a strength. A character who is definitively one thing tends to run out of available stories quite quickly. A character the audience can read 2 ways can be pointed anywhere. The audience supplies whichever interpretation makes that week work. A version where he is simply anxious turns sad after a few years. A version where he is simply dangerous turns mean at about the same rate. Keeping both on the table is also what lets the show change register without breaking anything. A gentle episode can lean on the anxious reading and get sympathy out of it. A darker one can lean on the dangerous reading and get a demolition derby out of it. Neither contradicts the other, because the show never committed to either. The temptation to resolve it must have been considerable, since a definitive answer about what is wrong with SpongeBob would have given 100 episodes a cleaner shape. Nobody ever took that option, across 25 years of opportunities to take it. Every new writing staff arriving on the series inherited a character with an obvious unanswered question attached to him, and every one of them left the question exactly where they found it. That is not how most long-running series behave when they change hands. New showrunners generally arrive wanting to put a mark on something, and the most obvious mark available here was sitting in a boating school waiting to be resolved. The question was still sitting there in the 12th season, and the 13th, and it is sitting there now. One more thing the series does with this deserves a mention, and it is the quietest and possibly the most honest. At no point across the entire run does anybody suggest that he stopped trying. 25 years is long enough for a real person to change careers 3 times over. Long enough, too, for somebody to have said something. The silence covers her as well, and that is stranger. Mrs. Puff has been hospitalized by this student, jailed because of him, stripped of her wages, fired, rehired, and at one point had the defining feature of her own body ruptured by a crash he caused. At no stage has anybody in Bikini Bottom suggested she stop teaching him. No colleague, no official, no friend. The town organized against him rather than around her. Whatever the arrangement between between those two is, everybody has quietly agreed it is hers to carry. Patrick has offered him advice on nearly everything else across that period, most of it catastrophic. Squidward has told him to give up on plenty of things he had no business attempting. Mr. Krabs has talked him out of ambitions that would have cost the restaurant money. On this one subject, the entire cast is silent, and the silence has held since 1999. Nobody has suggested a different career, a different school, or simply giving up. A friend would eventually say one of those things to somebody a quarter of a century into an unsuccessful project. The closest the town has come is forming an organization to keep him off the water, and that addresses their problem rather than his. He works within easy walking distance of his own house. Nothing in his life requires a boat. The pursuit continues because he wants it, and for no other reason anybody has ever articulated. All of that reads differently to an adult than to a child. A child watching sees somebody trying hard at a difficult thing and not managing it yet. A parent watching sees somebody who has organized a quarter century of his life around a document he does not need, taught by a woman who cannot leave, in a building that keeps falling down. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A joke that runs long enough stops belonging to the show that made it. This one has ended up in places nobody in that 1999 pitch meeting could have pictured. One of them is a prequel that goes back and quietly changes what Mrs. Puff was all along. Section 10. The gag that outgrew the show. The Palace Theater in New York opened a SpongeBob musical on the 4th of December in 2017, after a month of previews and a tryout in Chicago the year before. On stage, an actress named Abby C. Smith played Mrs. Puff. Tina Landau co-conceived and directed it. Kyle Jarrow wrote the book. A 26-year-old newcomer called Ethan Slater played the lead and made his Broadway debut doing it. The songs were farmed out to an unlikely list of musicians, among them David Bowie, Cyndi Lauper, The Flaming Lips, John Legend, They Might Be Giants, and Steven Tyler and Joe Perry of Aerosmith. It collected 12 Tony nominations, tying with Mean Girls for the most of that season, and won one for David Zinn's scenic design. Then it closed. The stated reason was a long-planned renovation of the palace, though the show had been playing to under 70% of its capacity, against a budget somewhere north of $18 million. After 29 previews and 327 performances, the final show went up on the 16th of September in 2018. A national tour followed in 2019, and the amateur licensing released alongside. It means school groups and youth theaters have been staging the material ever since. Most of the original cast reassembled the following year for a filmed version, broadcast across Nickelodeon and its sister channels in December of 2019. A performance of the boating school teacher now exists on tape in two entirely different media. Marketing for the production leaned on the boating school without hesitation. It describes SpongeBob as undeniably the worst student Mrs. Puff has ever had. A show that reached Broadway, with that list of names attached, still found the driving school worth putting in its promotional copy. Getting a cartoon onto Broadway is much harder than it sounds. Most attempts fail quietly and expensively. The version that worked did so by refusing to put actors in foam costumes, treating the characters as people, and trusting an audience to follow. Mrs. Puff came through that translation with her job intact. Somewhere in the world at any given moment, a teenager is playing a pufferfish driving instructor in a school hall. Nobody in 1999 would have understood that sentence. Neither would anybody working on the show at the time, since the character had existed for a matter of weeks and had been invented to settle a disagreement about whether a sponge could hold down a job. Southing. She began as a compromise in a pitch meeting. She has ended up as a role people auditioned for. Somebody out there has practiced her lines in a bedroom mirror. Somebody else was disappointed not to get the part. Strangest of All the Afterlives belongs to a prequel series about the characters as children at summer camp, and specifically to an episode built around a demolition derby. The episode is called Lake Crashers, and the campers are holding a demolition derby at the bottom of the lake. Mrs. Puff is there in her camp capacity, and she says out loud why she came. She came to keep them safe and protect them. Then the noise reaches her. She is asleep when it starts, wakes to the sound and the smell of it, and checks the arena through a periscope. The episode makes her visibly conflicted for a moment. Then she enters the derby anonymously, under a helmet, calling herself Driver X. What follows is not a woman losing her temper. She takes out both remaining cars, then pushes them around the arena like pinballs. She catches one, spins it, and flings it into a wall. She catches another, and shoots it straight up into the air. She is enjoying herself. She is very good at it. Nobody watching knows who she is. Her cover breaks for the only reason it could. Pearl crawls into the ring after a dropped ice cream. Mrs. Puff sees cars closing from both sides, and she launches herself out of her own vehicle, digs under the child, and puffs up around her. The helmet comes off. The campers find out who Driver X was. That does something considerable to the 8th season episode where she tries to have SpongeBob killed in an arena. This is a version of the character with no ruined school behind her, no criminal record, and no 13 years of him. The appetite for the crashing is already there. So, for what it is worth, is the instinct that makes her put a child inside her own body when the car cars come. Whether the writers intended that as a retroactive explanation is impossible to say from the outside. What it does in practice is take the single most criticized episode in the boating canon and quietly supply it with a foundation. The appetite was always in her, and SpongeBob simply gave it somewhere to point. The episode had a difficult time reaching anybody. Nickelodeon scheduled it for a summer afternoon in 2023 and pulled it for repeats of something else. Nickelodeon rescheduled it twice more that August and pulled it again. By the time it surfaced properly, it had been sitting finished for the better part of a year. A strange fate for 11 minutes of a children's prequel, and a stranger one for the 11 minutes that quietly explain the most complained about episode in the parent series. Deciding whether that improves the earlier episode or makes it worse depends entirely on what somebody objected to in the first place. Anybody whose complaint was that Mrs. Puff behaved out of character now has an answer of sorts, since the franchise has gone back and established that the character was always like this underneath. Anybody whose complaint was about a children's show staging an attempted murder has been handed nothing, and possibly something slightly worse, because the appetite is now presented as innate rather than earned. Prequels tend to create that problem for themselves. Explaining where a trait came from usually means deciding it was always there, and a trait that was always there stops being a consequence of anything. The version where 13 years of destruction turned a patient teacher into somebody dangerous is a story. The version where she was drawn to the crashing before she ever met him is a character note. The gag has turned up in smaller places too, and the smaller places are often funnier. A soundtrack album released by the show includes a fake radio advertisement for the boating school, complete with a slogan built around not letting SpongeBob drive. Merchandise like that is usually where a running gag goes to die, reduced to a slogan on a mug with the context stripped out. What is odd about this one is how well the joke survives the compression. The entire premise fits inside a single line about not letting one specific person drive, and anybody who has seen one boating episode understands it instantly. Compression turns out to be a decent test of whether a running gag is working or merely surviving. Jokes that need setup die the moment they leave the episode they came from. The ones that survive on a mug, in a slogan, or in a stranger's passing reference are the ones built on a premise simple enough to travel. A sponge who cannot pass a driving test travels about as well as anything a cartoon has produced. A 10th season episode gets an entire plot out of him mistaking an escaped convict for a substitute instructor. That is a version of the joke where the danger finally comes from the other direction. The video games have kept the material alive in their own way. The boat he briefly owned reappears under a different name in a racing title. The first season dream sequence, where Mrs. Puff destroys his license inside his own sleep, turns up as a playable level. Games do something to a running gag that television has no way of doing. They hand the whole thing directly to the player. A viewer watching SpongeBob fail a driving test is watching a joke happen to somebody else. Somebody holding a controller during the dream sequence is inside it, which turns a 20-year-old gag about failure into an activity with a fail state of its own. A neat irony sits inside that arrangement, and nobody involved seems to have planned it. A player working through that level can succeed at it. The one place SpongeBob's dream of a boating license can be completed is a video game, in the hands of somebody else entirely. That level has been finished tens of millions of times by now, across every console it appeared on. The dream sequence Mrs. Puff invaded in January of 2000 has been successfully completed more often than almost any scene in the series. None of it counts toward anything. The following episode still opens with him failing the same test in the waking world. The theories need a clear label before anybody repeats them. Audiences have built a fairly detailed criminal past for Mrs. Puff out of two background details. One is the reference to her having changed her name. The other is the newspaper headline about a deranged boat teacher escaping the authorities. Others have constructed explanations for how her husband died beyond the lamp the show put on screen. None of it has ever been confirmed by anything the show actually aired. They are Easter eggs that the internet has promoted into biography. That process happens to every long-running series eventually. A show this old contains thousands of background details, most of which meant nothing to the person who drew them, and an audience with freeze frame and decades of spare attention will find every single one. Some of those details were deliberate. Most were an artist filling a background at speed on a Thursday, and nothing about the finished frame distinguishes between the two. Freeze frame changed the relationship between shows and audiences more than anything else in the last 30 years. A background painted in 1999 was made to be seen for 4 seconds by somebody sitting 6 feet from a television set. That same background is now studied at full resolution, paused, magnified, and argued about by people who were not born when it was drawn. Nothing about it was built to survive that kind of attention. What remains, after all of it, is the machine described at the start of this video, still running exactly as designed. A network asked for a school and got one, though not the kind anybody in that meeting had in mind. A creator who wanted his character to be an adult invented a driving school instead. He invented a teacher to run it. That teacher turned out to be so useful that the company eventually wrote down a rule protecting her job by guaranteeing her student would never graduate. The rule held through a feature film era. It held through the death of the man who created the show, through spin-offs made by people who were children when the first episode aired, and through more than 1 million failures if anybody is counting, which nobody reliably is. Showrunners left. The animation moved. The audience turned over completely at least twice, and Steven Hillenburg died in 2018 without ever seeing his student pass. The arrangement he built to settle an argument with executives outlasted him, and it is still running now. Whether that is a happy outcome depends on which part of it somebody looks at. A compromise made under pressure produced a character the creator came to love, a setting the show could return to indefinitely, and a joke people who have never watched an episode can still recognize. It also produced a rule guaranteeing the main character will never get what he wants, enforced by a company document, for as long as the series continues to exist. He read a 7,000-page book in one night and lost the license to a tugboat. He passed cleanly and lost it to somebody else's parole violation. He held one inside a dream, and his teacher walked into the dream to take it away from him. Every single one of those failures was somebody else's doing. 25 years of that produces something an audience feels long before they could explain it. Nobody watching a boating episode is rooting against him. Nobody has ever needed to be told to be on his side. Permanence usually arrives that way, as a side effect of a decision nobody thought was load-bearing at the time. Nothing about the argument in that pitch meeting suggested anybody was building a joke that would still be running once the people in the room had retired or died. A creator wanted his character to be an adult. An executive wanted a classroom. The thing built to satisfy both of them turned out to be more durable than either position. In the first week of August 1999, that character threw a unicycle into a dumpster because he was certain he would never need it again. He rode home on it the same evening. He has needed it every single day since. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.